Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Benjamin Carano and this is part 2 of my series on building a Honda GX120cc motorized bicycle. So in today's video, I am going to be officially mounting the entire engine. And the first thing I'm going to be doing is building a custom motor mount. I was looking around and all the motor mounts I saw were just like two little tiny bolts that kind of went in on each side of the frame, and they were just really not very strong looking. I've got a heavy powerful engine, so I figured the best option was to custom build a motor mount. And lucky for me, I have a friend who was kind enough to let me use his shop and help me with welding a custom motor mount for this bike. So that's where I'm headed right now, to the shop to make the motor mount. So I'll see you guys when we get there. So this is a plate that I just cut out of 1/8 inch thick steel, and now I'm just using a grinder to smoothen out the edges and around some of the corners to get it ready for the next step. Alright, so there we have it. All the corners and edges are nice and smooth, and we're ready to move on to the next step. So here I have a steel tube that is commonly used for roll bar cages, and a really cool clamp I found that is machined and has 6 stainless steel Allen head screws holding it together. It has a 1.5 inch bore to go around the thickest tube of the motorized bike frame. And then that steel tube will just be welded to that clamp. But first I have to shape the end of the steel tube to fit the roundness of the clamp. So I'm just going to use a grinder for that and take my time and fit it really nicely to get a good weld. Alright, so that looks pretty good. It fits the curve of the clamp, and now we're ready to weld that on. Alright, so there it is, all welded onto the clamp. And now we're just going to cut it roughly to length. And then just using a handheld grinder with a cutting blade, I'm going to finish off that cut because it was kind of hard to hold it with the vice grips on the big saw. So there we go. We have made a few tack welds to weld the plate in place. You can see I've clamped the clamp around the 1.5 inch tube of the frame, a couple tack welds down there, and that was after holding the engine in for a little bit to get all the sizing right. So that turned out pretty nicely. And now the next part we'll have to do is put the other clamp and hook it up to the other side of the plate to add a little bit more strength. So now we're making the other tube. We're basically just cut some slots in it with a grinder and then welded those slots together after we bent the tube, and then just cleaned it all up and welded it on, and that is the finished product. So that other clamp I used is a 1¼ inch bore. So that will basically fit around the seat post tube. And that's the finished product. It turned out pretty nice. So now I'm going to send it to the sandblaster to get sandblasted and powder coated, and then we'll put it all together and put the motor on. Alright, so I ended up taking this piece to get powder coated, but they said that the minimum charge that they would charge me to powder coat it and sandblast it was going to be $150, which was a little bit out of my budget for something so small. So I am going to paint it on my own. And for the preparation, I just sanded it with some 80 grit sandpaper and wiped it down with alcohol to make sure any fingerprints and any oil was off of it. And then I plugged up each one of the holes with just rolled tissue, and I did the same thing on each one of the end pieces that will clamp and hold this to the frame. And then I just tied a string through the holes, which I will hold it by when I am spraying it. And first I'm going to be using Rust-Oleum Clean Metal Primer. This stuff has worked super well for me. And then I'm going to do about 2 or 3 coats of this. You can do coats a couple minutes apart. It dries pretty quick. About an hour later, I'm going to start coating it with a Rust-Oleum exterior high heat aluminum gray auto paint, which is semi-gloss, so it has a little bit of the clear coat mixed in with it, and that will give me a pretty good finish. Not quite as durable as sandblasting, but it'll still be plenty, especially for what I'm gonna do. I mean, this thing's so thick and big that by the time it's rusting and all that, my engine and my bike will probably be broken. This will last forever, so I'm not too worried about that. So yeah, I'm gonna be painting it with an aluminum gray Rust-Oleum exterior paint, and we're going to start by putting the primer on. So let me get that done really quick, and then I'll show you what it looks like after that. Alright, there they are, all primed up and ready to put the paint on. So now that that's done, I'm going to be using, like I said before, this Rust-Oleum High Heat Ultra long-lasting finish semi-gloss. So it's got a little bit of the clear coat in it, and then it'll be the aluminum gray. So I'm just going to do maybe 3 or 4 coats of that and see how things look, and I will get back to you guys as soon as the paint job is done. Alright, so here's the piece all nice and painted. It turned out really nicely, matches the exact color of the frame. Here's those 2 end pieces. So that'll basically just sit right down in there, like so. And then these clamps here are going to bolt on from the back side of each one of the tubes. And I'm going to put Allen head bolts through each one of these holes on both sides and tighten them down. But that will take me a while because there's a lot of Allen head bolts and these will get really tight. So I'm also going to put a little bit of grease on the insides where the metal makes contact and where the screws are, kind of, because there's some spots where when I stuck the bits of tissue down, you can see it didn't quite get paint on them, which is okay. But I'll just, make sure that those are good and sealed up with some grease before I go tightening everything down officially. So I will get working on that and show you guys when it's all done. Alright, so there is the motor mount, all screwed nice and tight in place. And you can see I've added some grease in there. So that turned out well. And now we're ready to put the motor on. So up there on the workbench is the GX120cc engine. And then I also made a 1/4 inch thick rubber plate, which I just bought some sheet rubber, cut it with some snippers, and then drilled some holes to match up with those 4 holes. so that just acts as a little bit of a barrier to take some of the vibration and spread the load. And usually engines are mounted with some sort of rubber washer or rubber plate underneath it, so that's what I'll be using for that. And then to bolt it down, I'm just using 2-inch. You could probably go with 1.5 or 1 3/4 inch screws. These are stainless steel, and then I have stainless steel washers and then lock nuts as well. So that'll be to bolt it down. And for these front bolts on the engine, I'm going to come in from the top down, because if you can see down here, there's not much room to come in from underneath with a bolt. So I'm going to go from the top down on the front two. On the back two, I'm going to go from the bottom up, because I have a lot more space on the bottom, whereas here, you can see there it's kind of getting really tight in there, and I don't have much room to thread a bolt down through the top. So that's how I'm going to bolt it up. So let's get mounting the engine. Alright, so there it is. The motor is mounted. It's a little bit loose right now, so I can kind of move it around and tip it just a little bit before I get things really tight on there, but it is on, and that is definitely looking pretty good. So next I'll probably be showing you guys how to hook up the fuel to the motor, as well as the throttle cable, which will be running from the existing throttle that we had put on this thing when we put the 2-stroke engine on it. So that turned out really nicely, and it's gonna look pretty good. Alright, so for the throttle cable, you can see here that I just have the throttle cable running from the existing throttle on the engine, and that will basically clamp underneath this thing right here, and then I will be hooking it up to this back piece so that when that cable is pulled, it pulls that throttle lever. So first what I'm going to do is I made a little custom bolt here with a slot running through it there, that goes almost like a little bit, maybe 1/8 of an inch down the bolt, and then stops about right there. And then a nut, and then I have a lock nut here as well that fits on this bolt. And again, all this hardware is stainless steel, as it's going to be outdoors. So I'm going to first put the ball end under the slot like that, and then push it down. That's how I'm going to hold it, and then I'm going to tighten this nut up tight against that ball right there. And I'm just going to use 2 wrenches to tighten this down really good and tight. Alright, so there we go. That's good and tight. And then after I clamp the throttle cable in, that's basically just going to go right through that hole back there, and then the lock nut's going to come on from underneath, allowing that to turn just barely so that when that pulls in, it can have a little bit of movement if it needs to. So now I need to grab a Phillips head screwdriver to take that out, and then I will assemble the whole thing together. Alright, so now I installed the lock nut on the bottom of that, and you can see that it swivels back there and holds that cable securely. And I took this little piece out. This is what it looks like. And I basically just want to pull the cable relatively snug and begin tightening this screw right here. And you can see that that side of it is going to go down and clamp this throttle cable right here. And I want to make sure the bend is where I want it, and then I can go ahead and tighten that screw down. Not super tight, but pretty snug. And there is the finished throttle. When I twist the throttle cable, the mechanism should accelerate nicely. So that's what it looks like from afar. Now let's get the gas line hooked up. For the fuel situation here, you can see that I don't have much space from the top of the engine to the fuel valve input here on the tank. So what I did is I took a 90-degree brass elbow joint here that I found at a hardware store. I think it was a 1/4 inch size, and then I can screw my fuel valve into the end of that to go off at a 90-degree angle back toward the carburetor, and then I can take the fuel line and go off of that into the carburetor. So I screwed that in. It took a little bit kind of getting the wrenches in there and everything. I probably should have done that before I put the motor in, but that's how I did that, because I don't have enough room to take my fuel valve and come straight down. So now I can get the fuel line hooked up. And if we flip the bike around, you can see that this is the fuel line right here. It is clipped in by this little red clip here. It's holding it in place because it used to go up to the gas tank, which was sitting on top of the engine. So first we need to take it out of that red clip there. Just pops out like that, and now we have free access to the fuel line. And then you'll also need to buy some excess fuel line, because you'll need a little bit more than what's already there. So I just got some other black fuel line on Amazon, and it came with 4 of these little fuel line clamps, which you don't really need if you have one of those slide-ons that has like the teeth kind of to grab the fuel line, but they're good to have just to make sure things are extra tight. So yeah, you'll want to unclip that, and now we can feed it around to the fuel valve. Alright, so you can see the valve poking out right there, and then our fuel line right here. So first I'm just going to take this really wide fuel clamp off of that and use one of my skinnier ones that came with the new fuel line instead. That'll just go on a little easier. And then I'm also going to use the fuel filter that I used on the old bike, the same type of fuel filter, and put it on so that the narrower end is going on that, and then this little like cap looking thing is facing that fuel valve, because we're going to basically run fuel line from that around to the fuel filter and then into here. So first I'm going to put the fuel filter right onto the end of this line right here, and it might be kind of tight because this fuel line is meant to be really tight. So again, slide the clamp as far down as I can get it, and try and push that on right there. There it goes. And then slide the clamp up till it sits in a notch right there, like that. Then I am going to take the other end, take some more of this fuel line here, and then put a fuel clamp right over one of the ends of it, and we're going to push that end onto this fuel valve back here. And again, it's going to fit kind of tight, but just wiggle it back and forth, and eventually it'll slide on there, like so. And then when it's on there, again, just take the fuel clamp and slide it all the way up. Till it sits well in one of those notches there. You can see that's on there good and tight. And then I'm just going to measure it to come around probably about right there. Cut it shorter if I need to, but I can't make it longer, so I'll cut it right there. And to cut it, I'm just going to use some scissors. Those get right through it. And then again, take my fuel clamp, slide it over the end, and then that should connect up nicely right there. Yeah. So then just slide it right over the other end of the fuel filter. And then again, take the fuel clamp, slide it up onto the fuel filter. If it'll fit there. Stuff's all so tight. There it goes. Again, just make sure it sits in one of those notches nicely. And that's all you gotta do to hook the fuel up. And then again, we've got our on and off valve right there. Comes around with the fuel. This hose could be made a little bit shorter if I wanted to, but just to test the bike out, make sure it doesn't have any kinks or anything like that. Again, that's what everything looks like from afar now. It's all looking pretty good. And later down, I might find a better way to kind of hide this fuel filter more, whether I kind of put it back in there or put it right up in here and make this a little cleaner, but for now, that'll do the job. Alright, so the last thing we need to do before starting the bike up for the first time is to go ahead and put the chains on. We need one of them there, and then the other one to go from that sprocket to the back wheel. And if you don't know how to use a chain breaker and need a little bit more assistance with putting the chain on, you can watch my other series on building the two-stroke motorized bicycle from scratch. That shows how I put the chains on that thing. So I'm going to do something similar on this bike, and I will get back to you guys as soon as I do that really quick. Alright, so there we have it. All the chains are now on and ready to go. So the next step is preparing the engine to be started for the first time. Alright guys, so that's it for this video. The engine is now officially mounted and ready to go. So stay tuned for part 3, where I will be doing all the last bits of maintenance and things to prep the engine to get ready for the first test ride, as well as doing a test ride. So stay tuned for that. And as always, if you like this video and it helped you out, then leave a like, comment below, and subscribe, and I'll see you in part 3.